On behalf of the Good Systems team, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. Good Systems is a grand research challenge at UT Austin. Our team of more than 70 researchers from across disciplines is working to define, evaluate, and build ethical, human-centered artificial intelligence systems. Today, we're going to learn more about work related to our core research project, which looks at misinformation, disinformation, race, and ethical machine learning systems. This event is going to be recorded and your Zoom should be showing that. So please do leave if you don't want to be part of this recorded event. We're also going to have a process for questions and answers. They are going to be reserved for the last 20 minutes of the hour, and our guest speaker does have to leave right at the end of the hour. If you could please put questions in the chat or use the raise hand function in Zoom, I can call upon you at the end. And we're grateful to have Deen Freelon join us from the UNC Hussman School of Journalism today, Journalism and Media, I should say, at the University of North Carolina. He is a principal researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, CITAP. His theoretical interests address how ordinary citizens use social media and other digital communication technologies for political purposes, paying particular attention to how identity characteristics such as race, gender, ideology influence these users. Methodologically, he is interested in how computational research techniques can be used to answer some of the most fundamental questions of communication science. Freelon has worked at the forefront of political communication and computational social sciences for over a decade, co-authoring some of the first communication studies to apply computational methods to social media data. Computer programming lies at the heart of his research practice, and I should add he releases this code regularly, and this generates novel tools and sometimes methods to answer questions questions regarding existing approaches which cannot be addressed. He developed his first research tool, Recal, as part of his master's thesis, and it has since been used by tens of thousands of researchers worldwide. Thrilled to have you, Deen.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Niraj. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully this will do what I want it to do. Let's see, I'm going to inflate that. So can people see this? Okay, great. All right. So thank you very much. I'm going to try to go through this in a timely fashion. The purpose of this talk is to introduce a tool that my team and I developed called PIEGraph, which is a new way of looking at social media data from what we call a Usereye view. And before I begin, I want to give all due credit to my colleagues at the Political and Civic App Division of the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, primarily Andrew Christ, our lead programmer, and Meredith Pruden, who is our postdoc. So they really helped a lot with this. I really could not have done this without them. So that having been said, let me go ahead and get started here. It keeps popping up. Okay. So the theoretical jumping off point, this is very much theory-driven research, comes from this idea of echo chambers, which is a concept with which I assume most of you have at least a passing familiarity. Now, the idea of echo chambers is one that I say that it has a crossover potential, or it is a crossover concept, because it's one that at least a while ago was widely discussed within the academy, probably less so now, but it still enjoys some discussion in the popular media, the news media and things like this. It's sort of a term that's become kind of a household term over the past 10 to 20 years. But if you've read any literature on this over the last few years, you'll know that the term has become increasingly controversial, and that although there are some individuals on the political extremes who do wall themselves off from opposing views, this is not the experience typically of the ordinary user. And so one of the goals of this project is to proceed beyond this idea of the echo chamber and to try to conceptualize what people are doing on social media politically in a way that accords better with their actual activities. And so to that end, I've begun to talk about in my work this idea of personalized information environments. Now, these are digital environments that are co-constructed by users and platforms. By users, they do this by following other accounts, sometimes friending them, depending on whether it's a unilateral or bilateral process. And then also by platforms, they contribute to these personalized information environments by algorithmic prioritization, and sometimes by pulling in content that's not what you follow, but that's followed by people that you follow. And so that's a co-construction there. And importantly, this term implies nothing about the contents of the environments, which may vary widely depending on many factors. And so it doesn't build in a theoretical hypothesis into the term itself the way echo chambers do. And you're able to get around some of those basic questions like, is it an echo chamber? Into wider and perhaps more interesting question, like, what is it? And what characterizes this particular environment that we happen to be looking at, or this set of environments that we happen to be looking at? Theoretically, there's a number of pedigrees here, harkening back to an earlier age of discussion when some of these environments were quite new, including mass self-communication, introduced by Castells, disintermediated media systems, and public spherules, none of which introduce sort of any expectations about what will be in these, but simply denote the personalized nature of these kinds of environments. So the Usereye view is not exactly a new concept, and so it bears some similarity to mention Trevino's idea of vertical data, but it's one that could use a fresh coat of conceptual paint, as it were. In the Usereye view, the whole idea is to see the personalized information environment the way the user sees it. And this contrasts widely with the platform-centric view, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's also quite methodologically difficult and expensive, especially relative to platform-centric research, which is the dominant paradigm in social media research for reasons that will become obvious if they're not already. Platform-centered view, this is an image that's adapted from Atomic and Glance 2004, which was a very sort of seminal piece in the analysis of social media. The data set here comes from the blogosphere, one of the first studies to demonstrate by network analysis methods that the blogosphere largely self-segregated into a blue cluster and a red cluster with only relatively thin sets of connections between. And so this is what the platform-centered view does. It takes out a large amount of data from a given platform or platforms, and then attempts to analyze that data on the basis primarily either from the basis of keywords that are used for selection criteria, or secondarily users, specific sets of users like Congress or certain celebrities or what have you. And that's the essence of the platform-centered view. I really want to stress at this point that the platform and the Usereye views are really complements. It's really about the kind of research question that you have in mind. I've done a lot of platform-centered views, platform-centered work, and I plan on continuing to do this into the future. So let's talk about what each one is good for. Platform-centered view is good for studying particular topics. And so if you look at a lot of my work, including most prominently the 2016 report that some colleagues and I did on Black Lives Matter, we had 45 keywords relating to the movement and police killing victims that we incorporated, and we used those as selection criteria for a bunch of tweets that we analyzed between 2014 and 2015. And so it was very good for that. Platform-centered view is good for understanding online group dynamics. For one example of this is determining which kinds of people are most influential or whose words spread the farthest when we're talking about a specific topic. And so these are the kinds of questions, and obviously this is not exhaustive, that platform-centered views are really good for answering. We talk about the user-centered view, the Usereye view. This is really good for understanding the content of specific personalized information environments. And so if you want to know how much content people are getting from different types, then you need to know what people are seeing. So you need to see as the user sees. as opposed to, if you're focusing on disinformation, misinformation, if you sample based on the disinformation, you're sampling on a dependent variable. If you sample on a particular topic, all you know is the total proportion of that topic. If your metrics are good, that counts as mis or disinformation, not how much people are actually seeing or engaging with that. Specific individuals are seeing or engaging with this content. Another thing the Usereye view is good for is determining how information diversity changes over time. So if you're looking at people's individual timelines, you can say, okay, at certain times or when certain events occur, that tends to be a real magnet for disinformation and misinformation. It's very difficult to determine this through the platform-centered view. Another thing that it's really good for is ascertaining the total amount of low-fact content in people's streams. So you can determine, for example, that there is X amount of mis or disinformation within a given social media system, even if you theoretically had access to all of it. But the user-centered view is really important for determining how much of that actually filters into individual users' streams, and whether it's the case that certain users end up seeing a disproportionate amount of this, how much of it is they end up, how much of it individuals end up seeing, and then also whether there are certain risk factors associated with that would be good fits for the Usereye view. So I'm going to talk about 3 case studies. The project that I'll be discussing is one of many attempts to study things, study social media data through a Usereye view. And here are some alternatives, and I introduce these by way of contrasting what our system does with these existing alternatives, which I want to stress are really complementary to each other. I certainly don't want to present PIEGraph, the system I'll be discussing, as any sort of replacement or superior alternative to any of these. It's really just something that provides a alternative view and has some advantages that these ones don't. It also has, some of these have some advantages that PIEGraph doesn't have. So this is really just by means of contrast here. So one of these is NetQuest. NetQuest is a very similar service to many others you may be familiar with, including Nielsen, ComScore, and others, which offers access to a panel of panel of users rather, who consent to the tracking of their data through mobile and web apps. These data consist of web URLs, domains, and timestamps. And researchers, when they contract with NetQuest, can see the URLs of whatever panelists visited. And so as a NetQuest user, whatever you track or whatever you visit is what's tracked. And researchers can see that. But if you're on a social media system and you're just looking at your stream, it won't see what you're looking at. It will only see what you actually click on. Let's see. The next one is WebHistorian, which was developed by my colleague and aforementioned individual, Erica mentioned Trevino, who's at American University. And it is a browser extension that reads users' Chrome histories, so it is restricted to the Chrome browser. It's also desktop only, another limitation. WebHistorian collects full URLs and timestamps for all of that. And so in that sense, it works very similarly to NetQuest. It's open source, unlike NetQuest, which is great. Another great feature of WebHistorian is that it allows and presents the kinds of visualizations similar to what are on the slide right now to the end user. And so it does provide an additional benefit aside from just taking the data from the user. It allows them to get a little bit of insight in terms of the sites that they visit most frequently. So in this example, which I took from their website, you can see that this user visits Google Docs, Yahoo, Facebook, Hulu, and Craigslist a fair amount. And that's something that's kind of interesting, that a user can get some insights into their history. So the last one I'm going to talk about is the Human Screenom project, which is developed by the Screenom lab at Stanford University. Users install software on their devices that take a screenshot every 5 seconds. This system is not limited to social media or internet-connected apps. It'll take a screenshot of whatever happens to be on the screen at that moment. Currently, they support Windows, Mac, and Android, which is a pretty wide set of platforms to support. And behind the scenes, the system conducts OCR, which is optical character recognition, automated image tagging, and human labeling of a subset of the data. Obviously, they're pulling in a whole lot of data, so they have to limit and focus where they do that. But clearly a very sophisticated system and one that solves a number of problems, which is limited by the complexity of the data that's pulled in and the volume, which increases based on the total number of users in the project, as well as the total amount of time each user spends on the screens that they have plugged in through this system. So this brings us to PIEGraph, which stands for Personalized Information Environment Graph. Some people call it pie chart. Please don't do that. Pie charts are terrible information visualization tools, which should never be associated with anything like PIEGraph. So totally different, and that's why I call it that. PIEGraph, as I mentioned earlier, is a specific tool with specific advantages and disadvantages. And as currently constituted, the system has three basic components. Firstly, a social media app used to collect Usereye data through, in this case, Twitter's API. Secondly, a database of over 3,000 web domains pre-tagged for political bias and factual content. The data are drawn from a site called Media Bias Fact Check, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. And the third component is a survey that collects basic demographic, political, and media opinion data from an opt-in panel of users. And so combined, these data sources give us a very nuanced and rich picture of our users' information environments, which I'll describe in just a bit. So the current research project, we are recruiting, in the process of recruiting 1,000 US demographically matched users from a panel company called Dynata. Each one will fill out a survey and grant PIEGraph permission to collect their Twitter data. Participants are compensated after permission is granted. What's really great about this project, unlike NetQuest and some of the other ones, no further participant action or background software is required after they grant access to our app. And so it's very easy from a user perspective, and participants can opt out anytime via instructions on our website. And our goal is to track participants for a minimum of a year. And so we'll see how that goes, collecting data on this and trying to figure out what the ins and outs and dynamics of the system are. So let me just really quickly show you what this system looks like. I think I may have to reshare this piece of it simply because I think I had, maybe I should try this, hold on. I'm gonna do this. Normally, let's see, where is my, here it is. We'll share this one. I don't know why it isn't allowing me to share the thing. Okay, hold on. There it is. So this is my PIEGraph that I'm showing you right now. And so this is what the users will see. So it's get past the permission granting screen because I've already granted permission. So this is what the user would see after they sign up for the system. So you can see that I've got a nice little chart of my Twitter activity. Each bubble represents a domain, web domain of a news or politics website. I'll mouse over, you can see right here, the Wall Street Journal, the Spectator, Forbes. Over here on the left, you've got CNN, Slate, WRIL, which is one of our local network affiliates, TV stations, NPR, The Verge, New York Times, Washington Post. So the dimensions here require a bit of explication. So left and right corresponds to political. Left and right, you can see that I've got a bunch over here on the left, and the vertical dimension corresponds to high information quality, or as we call it, factual content, or low factual content as determined by Media Bias Fact Check. You can see down here, I've got one at -1, which is low factual content, which is the UK Daily Mail. And so there are 5 of those in my feed going back to, when is that? February 9th. So this is a basic look at what we provide to users in terms of an individual visualization. And one thing that I'm really proud of is the fact that typically when I fill out the IRB application and they ask that question about what benefit your project provides to the end user, not counting the compensation, this is the first time I've actually been able to answer that question and say, yes, in addition to the compensation, we provide them this visualization that lets them sort of see what is going on, gives them a sense of the fact quality level of their individual information environments, and lets them possibly make some changes if they feel like they want to do that. So that's pretty cool. And this is individual for each user. So let me go back to my other slideshow here. There we go. So that's what that's about. So let me talk about Media Bias Fact Check. This is where we get all that data that allows us to put all that all those bubbles on our little 2-dimensional chart there. So Media Bias Fact Check is a site that offers comprehensive coverage of many widely used English language news and political sites. They offer detailed explanations of their ratings. And their data have been used in multiple peer-reviewed studies. They're pretty solid in terms of the ratings that they provide. They're one of several organizations that provide this data. And so we have a pretty good confidence in terms of the integrity of both their ideological ratings and their fact quality ratings. So just by way of example, here is the page, a snippet of the page that they provide for New York Times, showing that they consider it to be somewhat left of center, and that their factual reporting is high, which is the second highest level, the highest being very high. And they have a little bit of information generally about left center bias. At the bottom, you can see the link to their page. And so you can take a look at some of the criteria that they use to score the New York Times as being somewhat left of center on the ideological scale, and at the second highest level of factual reporting. So theoretically, I want to sort of return to this idea of fake news, which is a term that we see a lot in the public discussion of what is going on epistemologically in our society, as well as analytically in research studies. This is not something that I support. I know that a number of other researchers use this term analytically as opposed to being an object of study, which I think is totally fine. But as an analytical category, I don't think it's great. A number of studies that have studied supposed fake news have used these binary lists of low credibility or quote unquote fake news disinformation sites, and then basically cross-index that with a large data set and saying, okay, here's how much of this fake news or low credibility content that we end up seeing. That's an approach that PIEGraph represents in advance over, because we're looking at continuous fact quality ratings for major media and political outlets. So rather than excluding, a New York Times or Washington Post, we're going to include that as a high credibility site using the media bias fact check fact rating scale. A good analogy here is parts per million for drinking water. So, and you want to think about two major factors that are going to affect information pollution levels, the same way that would affect it in drinking water. This level of potential harm that the site has, in other words, whether it's high credibility or low credibility, and then its prevalence. So if you think about something that is very low credibility, the lowest level, but it's very rare, that's going to be less of a problem than something that's at a middle range, but that is very, very popular. So thinking about those two variables in tandem is very important when we're trying to evaluate the information quality or the level of information pollution in a given information stream. Critically, this perspective acknowledges that even mostly reputable sites can still carry misleading content at times. And so the information pollution idea comes from folks like Claire Wardle, Whitney Phillips, and Ryan Milner, who published on this recently, although the term itself actually dates back at least to the 1980s. So here's some key questions that I'm going to try to answer a little bit with the empirical research that I'm going to present. So looking at questions about how the following factors influence information pollution, including race, gender, ideology, and self-perceived ability to detect information pollution, as well as a question about which kinds of sites contribute most information pollution. The two that are sort of grayed out at the bottom are things that I think are will be really interesting to study in the future, but that I have not analyzed for this particular presentation. I put them there really just kind of for future consideration. So these data are from last week. And so this is based on timeline content at the time. We had 222 participants. We actually had 250, but 222 is the total number of users who had at least one link classified by media bias fact check. By looking at their timeline, if you think about the preponderance of links being left of center or right of center, there are 176 users with whose average link rating was left of center in terms of ideology, and 46 users that were right of center. So overwhelmingly left wing at this point. The mean ideological slant overall is negative 0.14. Normalized the metric to be between -1 and +1. Looking only at left of center, the average is negative 0.26. Looking at only at right of center, it's a 0.33, so relatively a little bit higher. The third row actually looks at the mean percentage of tweets containing media bias fact check rated news and politics links. Overall, that number is only 8.3%, which indicates that news constitutes and politics sites constitutes only a very small minority of the total amount of content that people are actually looking at in their timelines, which of course invite the question of what about the rest of it? And that's going to be a major topic of our research going forward, is trying to figure out the political implications of the remaining 91+% of sites that are not captured by media bias fact check. Big difference between left and right here. About 6% of left-leaning users by the timeline are media bias fact check classified. That number is almost 3 times as large for the right, with 17.5% being classified by media bias fact check if your timeline leans right of center. Finally, the mean content, fact content overall is 1.26, which is slightly over mostly factual, which is the 3rd level down. For left, it's a little bit higher, 1.39. For the right, it is below mostly factual at 0.75, so indicating that the left has a slightly higher overall mean fact content there. The time period here is mid-December of 2021 to last week. And then at that point, we had archived nearly 5 million tweets in these users' timelines. That number goes up every day. So this is a look at the deciles. I should have multiplied this by 10 to give you actual deciles, but you get the idea. Basically, the one at the left indicates that's sort of the highest ebb of percentage of a proportion of sites classified by media bias fact check. So just shy of 60% was the highest user. That drops pretty quickly to 90th percent of the 90th percentile, 9th decile, to about 25%, about 15% at the 8th decile, and below 10% for the 7th. So the drop off is pretty fast. And again, really does invite the question of what's going on in those users' timelines that's not being captured by media bias fact check. Again, major topic of analysis going forward. So on this slide and the following 5, I'm going to give you a look at some of the sites that are classified by media bias fact check, how prevalent they are in the timelines. You can see the timeline prevalence is listed, indicated by the y-axis, and then the ideological slant is indicated by the x-axis. And so this is the highest level, very high factual. And you can see that some of the kinds of sites, top 10 sites. You see Reuters, AP News, NPR, NASA, CDC, Science. Interestingly enough, the science ones were, are sort of operationally defined as not having any bias one way or the other. I think you can sort of debate whether that's the best choice or not. You can see that, interestingly, there seem to be no right-wing sites that have reached the top 10 here in terms of appearance on timelines that were at the highest or very high factual rating level for media bias fact check. Moving down to high factual, this is the second rating level for fact content down. We see our first right-leaning site, the Globe and Mail, which is pretty center right. It's only about less than 0.2 on the ideological scale. The remaining 9 are left of center, including people.com, USA Today, Hollywood Reporter, New York Times, Variety, and ABC7 Chicago. And so these are ones that are very high factual. You can still see a pronounced sort of left tilt here, although most of them are pretty close to the y-axis there. This is mostly factual, which is again 1 level down. We've gone from 1 red dot to 3, and the remaining ones we see here on the left: Today, Newsweek, Washington Post, Apple, and the right-leaning ones being Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Fox Business. And so the right is starting to populate a little bit as we go down, and we'll continue to see that trend with the mixed factual site, which is the 4th level down. This is the level that has Fox News, New York Post, and News 18. Interestingly enough, this level also includes CNN. There may be some pushback. Wait, why do they include Fox News and CNN on the same tier? But I will point out that NewsVault, which is media bias fact check's major competitor, also classifies Fox News and CNN on the same tier of its fact quality levels. And so there's some agreement to the idea that Fox and CNN, at least as far as their websites go, are sort of comparable in terms of the fact quality that they have. They're at least in the same ballpark, according to both NewsVault and Media Bias Fact Check. But just goes to show that there can be some level of disagreement about, what kinds of sites belong here. And I think that there is a distinction to be made, at least in the case of Fox, that the TV operation might get a very different rating than the web operation. Low fact content. This is the second lowest site, level of fact quality. Now you can see we've moved from 3 on the previous slide to 9 on this slide. You can see some of the major offenders here: rumble.com, Daily Mail, Hannity, One American News Network, Zero Hedge, and only one left-leaning site, one I hadn't heard of, which is politicalflare.com. So overwhelmingly, and also note that not only are these 9 out of 10 right, they're actually moving further to the right as we go down. Compare, right, the New York Post, like right in the 0.5 level, but most of those are further past 0.5 as we're looking here at the second lowest level. And this is the very low factual site level, which is the lowest level that media bias fact check assigns. And this is all, 10 of these are right leaning. And we see Russia Today, The Gateway Pundit, BitChute, WeLoveTrump.com, Sputnik, which is InfoWars. Sputnik is, and both Russia Today and Sputnik are Russian propaganda, state-owned. And so as we've progressed from the highest level to the lowest, we've seen a steady rightward move, not only in terms of the number of top 10 domains that are right or left of center, but also a steady movement from the center right to the far right. This is very important finding for us to take note of. So this chart looks at a correlation between ideological slant on your timeline versus individual fact rating means. So each dot here is a person. And so we can see here that we have a negative 0.31 correlation, pretty significant insofar as these two metrics, which tends to mean that as you move right from left to right, the average fact rating mean tends to go down. And so that does show that there's a correlation between consuming more right-wing content and content that is of lower fact quality. And we'll see whether the extent to which this persists as our panel grows. Okay. So here is the race breakdown. This is mean timeline fact rating by race. You can see here that we have some statistical power issues with the subgroups. White and Caucasian is certainly fine in terms of its size. Black African American is quite small. These are really demonstrative findings, right? So these numbers aren't really interpretable because the ends of the subgroups are so small. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what this would look like when our panel is done. This really doesn't show huge differences in terms of subgroups. The biggest differences between white, Caucasian, and Asian. It'll be interesting to see how that changes as we move forward, but the difference here is not that huge. It's between 1.2 and 1.6, which is less than half a point on the media bias fact check scale. So there are not major disparities as yet, but we'll keep an eye on this. So the breakdown in terms of statistical power between male and female is a little bit better. 105 males, 113 females. But again, this disparity is not huge. It's a little bit over 0.1. So not a huge difference in terms of timeline fact rating in terms of males and females. Could change again, but at this point, not a huge difference. When we look at it by ideology, we are starting to see a bit more of a difference between the largest and the smallest. So if you look at moderates in the middle, they're a little bit over 1.4, and very conservative is below, slightly below 1 there. So close to a half a point, but again, our subgroups are a little bit bigger, so we have slightly more confidence in these, in these results, which again may change over time. Notice that you're seeing almost kind of like an asymmetrical horseshoe pattern here, where the extremes are actually the two lowest values, very liberal, although that is higher than very conservative. The highest is moderate, but there's some. It's not sort of a straight march to the left in terms of how people self-identify. Notice also that these categories are how people characterize themselves and are not related to the ideological content of their links themselves. So this is kind of interesting, and we'll see how this progresses. The last one looks at this very specific question that we asked in the survey. I'm very good at determining when mainstream media are telling the truth. And we had very often or always, often, sometimes, rarely, never. So you can see here that there's no relationship at this point between people's confidence in being able to tell when the mainstream media is telling the truth and the total amount of quality content in their feeds. And so this actually goes very, very much with the studies that show that people are just not very good at being able to determine their own ability to find this stuff in the wild. And I expect that this will persist. And so we'll have to try to figure out how to bring people's perceptions more in line with reality to whatever extent we can. All right. So this is just another look at the data I was showing before. We looked at conservative, left-leaning versus right-leaning top 10 sites at the 6 fact quality rating levels. And so what this shows us is that we move from very high, as we move from very high to very low, we grow increasingly red. So from very high, 1 site at high, 3 sites for mostly factual and mixed, jumping from mixed to low from 3 to 9 sites, and 10 for very low. That's 100%. So that's something that I think we really need to take a look at. And this is based on actual timeline patterns. This is what people are actually looking at, what's actually popping up in their timelines, which is a little bit disturbing that the ideological slant is so skewed in this particular way when you look at it in terms of the fact quality. Considering the answers to the questions that I asked, so we have the race gap is about 0.34, but again, the subgroups are pretty small there. The gender differences, we're looking at the gender gap of about 0.11. Those are larger subgroups, a bit more confidence in that one. Asymmetric horseshoe pattern, as I mentioned, with ideology, and then with self-perceived information pollution detection, there's not really any correlation between that and the amount of information pollution in each user's timeline, or the aggregate amount across all users' timelines. So I want to return to PIEGraph as an approach at this point. Talk about some advantages and disadvantages. So one advantage is you see what the user sees, and these are the fact that I want to point out that clicks are not required. So in other words, you don't actually have to look at what people click on, but the simple content that is in their information environment that they have co-created with the platforms are what we're looking at here. We capture more than just URLs. We can also capture hashtags, usernames. Twitter now offers named entity content in the form of annotations that we can capture. So lots of very rich data that we can look at here. We cover both mobile and laptop content through API access. So no apps are necessary. We have a pre-tag database that's highly extensible based on media bias fact check. We can have all sorts of pre-existing tags that I'll talk about in a little bit. The system is lightweight, non-intrusive, and fault tolerant. So rather, compared to having an app that's running on your system, it's not going to crash or need updates. It's all sort of centralized, and Twitter manages the connection between our app and the user, which the user can revoke at any time. And also the system will be open source when we publish it. We're not quite done with the documentation, but at some point this year, we do hope to make the system open source. Several disadvantages I should acknowledge. It only supports Twitter for now. That's not a limitation in terms of the technical aspect, but rather in terms of terms of service, which Facebook used to allow this kind of user iView access, but it no longer does so in the wake of Cambridge Analytica. The architecture doesn't support non-internet apps. So this is primarily a social media type thing. So unlike Screenom, we can't get non-internet content. It doesn't capture what users click on. Now, we've thought about ways to do that, but it would actually require more of an imposition on the user than we already do. But that's a major area of improvement moving forward, is trying to figure out what users click on versus what is present in their information environment. Finally, the system is vulnerable to changes in corporate data policy based on this idea of the post-API age that I've talked about. And users Twitter could change things up on us. We hope they won't. I'm in contact with some folks over there at Twitter, and so hopefully, if they did change that API access that we're using for PIEGraph, they would at least give us a heads up so we can figure out some alternative to keep our system running. So the idea of the pre-tag database is incredibly useful. It can be extended to cover a number of use cases. For example, a broader topic classification scheme for domains could allow researchers to analyze how users allocate their attention. And I mentioned this earlier, trying to capture that 91% that's not already tagged by media bias fact check is a very important goal moving forward. I want to also take a look at a race and gender tag database that could be used to study racial diversity and gender diversity. So this is kind of flipping the idea of the echo chamber on its head, saying rather than looking at how ideological diverse it is, we can look at how racially and gender diverse it is. I'm also trying to figure out how to use a database of local and national TV, radio, and print outlets that could help us understand how much local news people are encountering, as compared to national news. There's been some funder interest in this. I have to get a proposal together, but I think that could be a really, really nice use of this system. And finally, the last one is combining the existing MBSC database with a broad classification of top influencers, which could reveal alternative routes by which apolitical people receive political content. So if you're familiar with the recent sort of Joe Rogan, Neil Young controversy, right? These are people who, talk about politics kind of sporadically, maybe more so in Joe Rogan's content than Neil Young's, but trying to reveal these alternative routes by which people become apprised to politics, people who don't typically follow, CNN or Fox News or some of these other explicitly political accounts. So just in conclusion, right, people are affected by much more than what they click on. Exposure to headlines, hashtags, and other inline content can shape people's views. The illusory truth effect and confirmation bias amplify this tendency over time. And again, just want to stress that PIEGraph and other Usereye approaches are complementary, and you should really try to consider whether PIEGraph would be a good fit for you for your research project. And I'm happy to help you think about that if you see anything potentially valuable in the system that we've developed. These are other ongoing projects that I have. I'm actually not going to talk about this. I'd rather get straight to the Q&A. So I'll stop there and allow people to ask questions. So I'm right at 3:45. So that's great. So happy to.
Thank you so much, Dean.
Sure. Yeah. Hopefully that was mostly comprehensible. And I'm happy to take any questions if folks have them.
Yeah, thank you for an absolutely wonderful and engaging talk, Dean. The floor is now open to questions. I put a note in the chat if you can put questions either in the chat or use the raised hand function in the reaction section of Zoom. So we'll start with Brad. You've got your hand up. If you can go ahead and ask your question to Dean, that'd be great.
Great, yeah, thanks for the talk. Very informative, very interesting tool as well. I've only collected tweets through Twitter API. I didn't know you could actually collect data on what people are looking at rather than what they're posting. So that's pretty awesome.
Sure.
I guess my main question is, so a lot of this depends upon the fact-checking site, right? And how media bias fact check and how dependable it is, right? And I know you mentioned you looked also at their competitor. I'm not sure if there's, I imagine there must be like more some perhaps center right fact checking sites, and I'm wondering if you looked at those and at all, because I imagine media bias fact check is probably center left, despite as all of its efforts. I'm not sure, how unbiased they could be in reality, right? So I'm wondering, or maybe they are. I'm just wondering how you kind of approach this issue in selecting them.
Sure. Well, in the first instance, bias is inescapable, right? There is no unbiased, site. So the bias may not be ideological, but it certainly exists, right? So that's one of the big findings of sort of media and communication research, right? The media is not, left or right biased. It's like disaster biased. It's biased in favor of the deviant. And this is right, something that folks have been really pounding our hands about for decades. And so the bias of media bias fact check is something that you can determine for yourself if you would like. It's on the web, you can check it out. I think, in my estimation, and this is evidenced by the fact that they place CNN and Fox News on the same footing, I think they're actually bending over backward to give the right credit and have them have some, items that are, at those upper echelons. And so I find it quite telling that even a site that's willing to put CNN and Fox News on the same echelon still has so many right-leaning sites at their lower echelons. And so I think, and also a lot of the designations that they have go right along with right-wing portrayals of sites like the New York Times being judged as being center-left. So I actually think that the New York Times would probably dispute that and say they're probably straight down the middle. But yeah, so I think that I think bias is inescapable. I have not seen that media bias fact check has been, politically motivated. They seem to have a genuine interest in scoring these sites as accurately as possible. And in terms of a center right or right wing alternative, I haven't seen any that have been nearly as comprehensive as media bias fact check, but certainly it would be interesting to take a look if you know of any. I'd be interested to take a look at those and really just try to figure out the extent to which they agree with media bias fact check and its competitors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Next, we've got Joel. If you want to go ahead and ask your question of Dean.
Hello, Dr. Freelon. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. I was just wondering if you had experimented with any of like the kind of new NLP systems that are using like knowledge graphs and stuff for fact checking, and just if you guys had any plans to like see if they produce okay results for you and help your analysis.
Sure. Yeah. I have not personally. If there are specific systems that you're referring to, I can certainly look them up and give you, a more solid answer at a later date. I'm a little bit skeptical of automated fact checking generally. Now, I think if the process is an aggregative one, where you're trying to be like a Rotten Tomatoes of fact checking site, that would be kind of interesting. But if you're trying to look directly at the content itself and trying to check it on an automated basis, that seems like it would be something that would be, trivially easy to game, right? Because we know that these systems that try to engage in this kind of work are not nearly, as rigorous as a human would be. And so I think that, at least unless there have been, major advances in AI that I'm not aware of, it seems to me that the level that commercial products are at would be pretty easy for, like basically competent human to figure out how to make their way around. And so, again, if there are specific systems that are out there, I'd be happy to look at them. I'm sure you probably know about a whole lot of systems that I don't, but at current levels of technological development of which I'm familiar, it doesn't seem like you'd be able to point a system at a social media site and have it give you any kind of reputable and valid scores for the content simply on the basis of an automated analysis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll move next to Sam and then to Nikhil.
Sam is muted.
All right, now I'm back. I was just saying thanks so much for the talk.
Sure.
I'm the Good Systems chair. It was wonderful to have, and we're happy we'll be, we recorded it. We'll be able to pass it around our network further. The question I have is that I love your tool. I of course, I think as many of us did, I checked myself out as quickly as I could, and I was very
Sure.
happy because I had this very, very factual, very middle of the road rating.
Mhm.
And then I looked, and it was really just one tweet from the Cook Political Report that came
Nice.
in on my timeline and giving me this great profile. But I think over time I may drift. But my question really follows up, I think, on the first question, strictly Joel's, because I'm an English professor, so I'm going to ask you a math question, but I'm
Sure.
hoping that you're kind of more mathy than I am on the spectrum.
Could be.
And it's a question about graphs, right? Because what you have here is, a very linear two-dimensional graph,
Yep.
which is really useful. But of course, in many instances, a polarity that one observes is a polarity for one perspective, but not for another. So to use the Neil Young, Joe, what's his name, Rogan example, right? Like, they're, in a tiff over a highly left-right polarized issue, but to somebody looking at their tiff, who's like, let's say, like a, radical Marxist, they might be like, well, these are two rich people fighting over, ways to make money, right?
Sure.
And to me, the terms of the whole discussion, in fact, represent something that I'm polarized against. And so, like that kind of, sort of perspectival polarity, right, would argue for something like a knowledge graph or like a multinodal graph approach as a way to try to construe these things, which then would get tremendously complex.
Sure.
Right. So I'm just wondering, like, how you guys, like in setting up something like this, how you think about these questions of like, what are the vectors and could there be more than two?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm going to fall back on that old economic saw that all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, what we try to present in the display that we give to users is a simplification along axes that, one, they'll be familiar with, and that, two, have some degree of academic validity. And so certainly we don't expect for our display to be comprehensive in terms of all dimensions of the domains that it could possibly capture. Because I don't think, because one, I don't think that's possible. Even if it was, it'd be so complex that your average person wouldn't be able to interpret it. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to give a presentation that somebody without a PhD will understand, and that will convey some interesting information about their timelines along axes that they're actually going to care about. You know, and that's really it. I think it's a fairly modest goal. I think that some of the research that we do in terms of when we publish on this could get at some of the more complexities that you talk about. But I think in terms of showing something to the user, we also have to acknowledge that these aren't people, in many cases, with PhDs. We want to give them something that is interesting and valuable to them, also respecting the fact that they don't have, you know, unlimited time to take a look at this, that they can hopefully maybe spend a minute or two with this, take a look at it, understand it, and get a general sense of where their timeline falls in terms of the content that they consume. We hope that as long as we can get that done, we're good.
Yeah, it's really helpful to think about it as a model, because also it's a model that's responsive to prior models that people have.
Certainly, yes.
You
And so,
had the idea of the dichotomy. Well, it's real. Yeah.
right, and you know, leveraging people's existing knowledge, I think, is really critical in terms of. I didn't want them to have to like read a whole, you know, academic paper first before they could understand it, right? So.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll move on now to Nikhil.
Great, thank you, Dr. Murthy, and also thank you, Dr. Freelon, for your presentation. So my question was, I was curious how you think about going from, you know, the findings you take away from PIEGraph, identifying things such as you can predict the amount of misinformation based on someone's ideology, or at least that's my understanding. How do you go from that knowledge to thinking about things like either policy recommendations or thinking like from a solution lens? And I completely appreciate that the PIEGraph provides a lot of value to the individual. So I was curious if what your thoughts were like and how you think about you know, from a solution lens. Is it mainly at the individual level, how empowering individuals to learn more about the content they're consuming, or is there some impact of this on what social media companies do, what social media platforms should look like, then things like that?
Sure. So I think in terms of policy, you can look at that and consider that from a couple of different angles. So I think when we're talking about government policy, the levers that we have access to in this country are relatively limited, especially by the First Amendment, in terms of how certain domains or certain social media accounts, the extent to which that they put out low quality information. You have to ask yourself whether that's a determination you really want the government making. In terms of social media company policy, you know, I think that they've got a number of ways of looking at, you know, the amount of low quality information that's spread on their platforms. One way I think PIEGraph could be helpful is by saying or by indicating the total proportion of content in somebody's feed that falls below a certain level, right? So you could say, you know, and that could be an evaluative component of some metrics or methods of reducing that content. So you say, well, after we introduced this, you know, method of doing it, it reduced the total amount of low quality information in people's feeds by X%, or the total proportion of low content in somebody's feed that falls below this level by this %. So I think as an evaluative, you know, metric, it certainly does have some value there. On an individual level, one thing that we talked about doing, but we ultimately didn't do, was surfacing individuals and showing on an individual basis the usernames of people who tweet large amounts of low quality information and offering them the ability to unfollow those individuals. Now, the reason we didn't do that is because then that sets up PIEGraph as a system that you know, interferes in the sort of natural, quote unquote, occurrence of what we're trying to study. And so it compromises the validity of any research that might be based on it. And so what's interesting there is the sort of public, you know, service aspect of it is to some extent in conflict with the research value of it. And so we're thinking about how to reconcile those differences, maybe with an experiment or something like this. But at this point, we want to be able to observe so that we can properly diagnose rather than allowing people to sort of unfollow on the basis of that content. Now, they can still do that if they want to. We just don't make it super easy for them.
Thank you.
If you did that as well, you'd probably be the subject of an InfoWars article.
Yeah, well, I think we absolutely would be. There's a number of reasons. Now, that's not a reason not to do it.
No,
But,
of course.
You know, I think our issue is more about the validity of the work and trying to keep that at as high a level as possible.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've come to time, and I want to be very respectful of your time also, as I know you've got to get to a meeting. Well, thank you so much, Professor Deen Freelon, for joining us today and for the absolutely wonderful and engaging talk. And I know I can speak for everyone for the very thoughtful responses to everyone's questions as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in today's Good Systems event.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Bye now.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.